Good morning and happy Sabbath.
Good morning. Happy Sabbath.
I'm very glad to be here with you and open the Bible and the Word of God and study from it and draw lessons of life. This morning I'd like to take your attention to a miracle that the Lord had performed in which He Himself was involved. This miracle involves the walking of water. As most of you have gotten the bulletin, the title of the day's topic is Walking on Water. And to better understand the entire scene and what is happening in this instance of walking on water, we need to read three passages from Matthew, Mark, and John. We're going to read three passages to give us an understanding of what is going on in the surrounding area, chronologically, and in the life of the disciples. So let's go ahead and open with me in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 through 33. In the book of Matthew chapter 14, and I invite you to open your Bibles and together read with me, and straightway Jesus constrained His disciples to get into a ship and to go before Him unto the other side, while He sent the multitude away. And when He had sent the multitude away, He went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, He was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit. And they cried out in fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. 28. And Peter answered and said unto Him, Lord, if it be Thou, bid me come unto Thee on the water. And He said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go unto Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth His hand and caught him, and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And 32, and when they come up to the ship, the wind ceased. So here in Matthew chapter 14, we are given a story. Okay, and it begins by telling us that Jesus was with the multitude. He sent the disciples away. He went up into mountains. The disciples were in the midst of the sea or lake. The winds came, and the disciples were afraid. And that whole Peter story about him walking on water. These are important facts. I want you to pay attention to them because they will be important as we understand the meaning of this parable. Because it's more than just Jesus walking on water, defying the law of gravity as we know it. It's a lot more than that, okay? Let's now go ahead and complete the picture with the missing puzzle pieces from reading in Mark chapter 6 verse 45 through 52. Right next book, Mark chapter 6 verse 45 through 52. And it says, And straightway He constrained His disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while He sent away the people. And when He had sent them away, He departed into a mountain to pray. And when the eve was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and He alone on the land. And He saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch of the night, He cometh unto them walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. But when they saw Him walking upon the sea, they supposed it has been the Spirit, and cried out, for they all saw Him and were troubled. And immediately He talked with them, and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. In verse 51 and 52, And He went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered, for they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Interesting passage here. We're giving a little bit more information. One of the reasons why they didn't believe in the miracle, because their heart was hardened. Why was their heart hardened? We'll get to that in just a minute. And let's go ahead and complete this story by reading in the book of John, chapter 6, verse 15 through 21. Mark, Luke, John. I'm just telling you how to get there quickly. In the book of John, chapter 6, verse 15 through 21. And when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself, alone. And when even was now come, his disciples went down unto the sea, and entered into a ship, and went over the sea towards Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they see Jesus walking on the sea, and drawing nigh unto the ship, and they were afraid. And he said unto them, It is I, be not afraid. And 21. And they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land whither they went. Interesting, 3 passages. The same story, different writers. They all give a little bit different recollection of the facts. The fact was the same. I mean, the bottom line was that Jesus was walking on water, and they were afraid. They were in the sea, and Jesus walked up to the ship, and when he onboarded the ship, the winds calmed. What's interesting to know about this story? When does this particular story take place chronologically in the history of this world and in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ on this earth? This miracle takes right after the feeding of the 5,000. But what's so important about the feeding of the 5,000? After feeding of the 5,000, notice what John tells us that started to happen. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to take your attention to 6:15. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force, John 6:15, to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. What is beginning to happen here? What is beginning to happen here with the people, with the disciples? They're starting to want to establish a literal kingdom that Jesus just got done preaching about. So Jesus talks about this kingdom that is to come, and the freedom of slavery and the freedom of oppression and all these things. And here these people think, wait, he is here. He is a powerful, motivating speaker. He can do all this miracle. Let's crown him king. Jesus is seeing the things that are happening, okay, and he does what? He tells the disciples quickly, go to the other side of the sea, and he departs, okay? That's going to become very important as we get into the story more. So, he told the disciples to sail on their boat to the western shore of the sea. And at midnight, as he was walking, or actually a little past midnight, as he was walking, contrary to the winds, okay, that were raging the sea, and they were afraid. And what did Jesus tell them? It is I, be not afraid. So again, I want to emphasize, why does Jesus force the disciples to go without him? As I've already pointed out, in all the passages, in Matthew 14:22, Mark 6:45, and John 6:15, it tells us that in fact, all these passages give us different explanations. So if you were to read them again and carefully look at the choice of language being used here, so especially in John 6:15, what does it say here? Okay? 6:15. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself. Okay? So they were realizing that Jesus was realizing the situation that was escalating. He quickly wanted to calm it down by removing himself and putting his disciples from harm's way. Why? Because they were being sucked in, they were being, kind of hyped up by the crowd, by the cheerfulness, by this revolution that the crowd wanted to instigate, to overthrow the Roman Empire and so on. But I want to point your attention in Matthew 14:22, the urgency that is present here in Matthew 14:22. Notice the choice of words that is being used. Matthew 14:22. And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side while he sent a multitude away. He constrained them. In another translation, the word is used, he made them, which implies he compelled them, and when he says, and immediately he departed, it basically reemphasizes the urgency of this event. We're given a picture here that things were not calm. The words like made, constrained, immediately, compel. These are the words of urgency, meaning that we're painted a picture that the revolution was starting to happen. Jesus wanted to quickly get them away from the crowd, which was so excited about the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 that they wanted to take him and make him king by force, as we read in John 6:15. This is the mob mentality. Right? We've all seen it. In Baltimore, you and I have been witness just a few years back what had happened. The mob mentality, when it begins to flame, it goes on and the people are cheering and beginning a revolution. This is what Jesus wanted to remove him and his disciples, because his disciples were yet weak. They were susceptible to the crowd's influence of wanting to make him a king. Just prior to that, they were arguing who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of God. Just prior to that, they wanted to know when is this kingdom going to become literal. And now when they see that this revolution, these people that they have supporters, they're like, wait a minute, now it's the time. Let's do it. But Jesus wanted to remove the disciples because they were susceptible to the influence of the crowd. Now that we understand the situation, now that we chronologically see where this is happening in the history of the Bible and the life of Jesus, we need to get into the specifics and discuss the actual language that's used here a little bit more. And particularly verse in Matthew, since you're there, Matthew 14:27. Matthew 14:27, what does the Lord say? Okay, Matthew 14:27. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. What is going on here? The disciples saw a ghost approaching. Different people, both Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they describe it differently. A ghost, a spirit, an object. They didn't know what it was, right? Something was coming towards them and they started to get afraid. Probably more afraid than of the storm in which they were. I would bet that they dropped their rowing and they started to fear for their life because of this thing that was coming towards them. Right? Because they have been in the storms before, right? They have dealt with the winds, right? They're professional fishermen. It's their business. It's their job. Now, granted, they're having a career shift here, but nevertheless, they were professional fishermen. They knew how to handle a storm. Apparently, it was still quite large, but at this point, they dropped everything that they were doing and they started to fear for their life because of this thing that was coming towards them. Okay? Now, what does Jesus say? We read, Be of good cheer, it is I. I want to now remember I mentioned we need to get into specifics of each word. When we look in Greek, this particular passage, only two words are used. Ego, yemi. And they're much more powerful and significant than we realize. And these words, ego, yemi, it does not translate to it is I, but it translates to I am. I see the light bulb in some of your minds came on. Now, with that knowledge, let's read again Matthew 14:27. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, I am, be not afraid. Wait a minute. I am? What does I am mean? That's right. When do we have the first mention of the same ego yemi, or the I am being mentioned? Exodus chapter 3, verse 13 and 14. And this passage, if you get nothing out of this study that we're reviewing today, this passage, the relationship between Matthew 14 and Exodus 3 is that unites the two testaments together, and it tells me that I serve the same God from the Old and the New Testament, the I am. And notice what it says in Exodus 3, chapter 3, verse 13 and 14. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is this name? What is his name? What shall we say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God said, moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, The Lord God your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. Okay? What does this passage demonstrate? It gives us the definition of the word I am, which is ego eimi in Greek, which is the same used the same in Exodus chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 14. Okay? This is very important to realize, that the same I am is present in both instances. Okay? Now, what is he declaring here? He is declaring that he is the Yahweh of the Old Testament, the I am, the Messiah. But there are other instances where he refers to him as I am as well, where he amplifies that. Notice when he refers to him, and we don't have to turn, but in John chapter 6 verse 35, we don't have to turn to John 6:35, but we know it. I am the bread of life. Ego eimi, the same I am from the Old Testament as in the New Testament, the bread of life. He goes on, John 8:12. I am the light of this world. Ego eimi, the light of the world. John 10:11. I am the good shepherd. Ego eimi, the good shepherd. The same I am. What I'm going here, what I'm illustrating is that parallel, that Jesus is the same. Nothing has changed between Old and the New Testament. We have to get this out of our head, that the New Testament is some addition to the Bible, that the Old Testament is the real deal. That is not accurate. It takes place in a little bit different, place of the world history. But the same main character, the I am, is present in both. Okay? 11:25, John, I am the resurrection. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Revelation 1:8, I am the life and the Alpha and Omega. So these are the instances. There are other mentions of the same reference where I am is amplified, and we're told that I am in the New Testament is the same as I am in the Old Testament. Okay? Now, Let's move on to one of the greatest I ams found in the Bible that is taking place in John chapter 18, verse 4 through 6. Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. And as soon as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Brethren, the Garden of Gethsemane is the night before the crucifixion. The I am lesson was made unambiguous. It's open to us. The I am, the same I am from the Old Testament, from all of the John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke references I just mentioned, and from John 18 is the same I am. Okay? And it is the same I am that came to the rescue of the perishing disciples. It is the same I am that is willing and ready to come to our rescue today, if we but ask him. Okay? So, now, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about this, this story, right? The disciples at this point are a little conflicted, right? They're conflicted. They don't know what's going on. They saw the ghost. It turned out to be Jesus. Peter walked on water with Jesus. They got into the boat. The winds calmed. They were safely able to dock at shore. Okay? So these are the things that perplex the disciples. I mean, Jesus' power over the law of nature, his presence, his ability to walk on water. These are the things that started to confuse the disciples. And what do we realize here in this passage? What does the Bible here want to illustrate through all these instances that I've just mentioned? One of the most important lessons we need to realize or learn from this particular passage is that all things are possible with the Father and Jesus Christ. Amen. Starting with walking on water, calming the sea, as well as removing trouble. I want to point your attention to a few passages that answer the question, what do the contrary winds represent? Now, we read about it in Matthew, Mark, and John. Let's read again. Let's go back to, if you're in John, go to John 6:18. Just a few chapters back, read in John 6:18. What do the contrary winds represent? John 6:18. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. Okay? So this tells us that there was a wind that blew on the sea. Now we need to read Mark 6:48 to further fill the puzzle that's missing here. Mark 6:48. What do we read? Mark 6:48. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he cometh unto them walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. Okay? So, in one instance, it tells us that there was a great wind. But in another instance, it tells us that they were toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them, meaning the wind was against them. And in Matthew 14:24, we read, but the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. That in addition to the wind, there were huge waves that were tossing and covering the ship, okay? So we're given here a worrisome picture. That the disciples were not in a happy place at that time, right? The storm was a real trial for the disciples. The storm was a real trial. But notice again, and I emphasize it for a reason, why does the storm and this experience happen shortly after them wanting to crown him king? Think about it for a minute. Why does this storm and this emphasis of the contrary winds occur shortly after them wanting to crown him king? The storm was the real test for the disciples, right? They were to face the difficulties and challenges. Jesus was preparing them for a much greater disappointment, for much greater tribulation, right? Similarly to us, every one of us is on the sea of life that eventually experiences circumstances that are opposite to us, right? Mm-hmm. The circumstances of life are not always in our favor. You're not always having a peachy and rosy life. You will have challenges and situations that may be disappointing to you and your family. Okay? Now, Job chapter 5 talks about it very beautifully. What does he say in Job chapter 5 verse 7 through 8? Job chapter 5 verse 7 through 8. Yet man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. I would seek unto God, and unto God would I commit my cause. What does Job here tell? He tells us something that the disciples had forgotten. Yet man was born in trouble as sparks fly upward, but as for me, I would seek God, and I would commit my cause unto God. The disciples had failed to commit their cause unto God. They wanted to crown him king. They wanted to take it up in their hand, make a revolution, set themselves free, and live happily ever after. That would happen, but it wasn't the right time and place. Okay? And at last, we come to Peter's story. Peter's faith. What happens to Peter's faith? Why does his faith fail? And notice only one writer mentions this Bible verse. Matthew 14:31. Only one writer out of the three writers we read mentions this particular instance. Matthew 14:31. What do we read here? And immediately, let's start with verse 30. Matthew 14:30. But when he saw the winds boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand, and caught him, and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Why does Peter's faith fail? Why did Peter's faith fail? What do we read earlier in these passages? We see that Peter asks for a sign from this apparition, from this spirit, from this ghost, who really is Jesus. He says, if it's really you, he's still doubting. It's the voice of Jesus, he looks like Jesus, he talks like Jesus, but Peter's still doubting. He says, if it's really you, let me come. Let me walk up to thee. And Jesus says, come. Right? His response constrains an implicit pledge that Peter would not be engulfed in the raging waves, right? He says, come unto me. And Peter does just that. He gets out and he walks on the water towards Jesus. Okay? Now, what do we know about Peter that's not mentioned in these passages? And this is not the sermon on the life of Peter. There will be other sermons on the life of Peter, and there have been already preached from this very pulpit. But what do we know in our short knowledge of reading about Peter? That he was a very impulsive. He was a very self-proclaimed, arrogant, impulsive man that has relied on his strength, power, and knowledge, all combined or one at a time, to make himself who he was in reality. Okay? And what does Jesus here begin to do? He begins to shatter the faith of he begins to test and thus shatter Peter's self-sufficiency, self-indulgency, self-righteousness. Okay? And how does he do that? When Peter started to walk on water, the minute he started to look back and try to identify whether or not he's being looked at by his fellow comrades and so forth, that minute he begins to sink. And no sooner than he begins to sink, he cries out, "Lord, save me." Jesus is teaching him that you need Jesus, you need me in your life to really survive. You can be strong, you may be a good swimmer, a good fisherman, but you really need me in your life. And notice how Jesus talks to him. He doesn't say, "Why did you bother to come?" But he says, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And he said that after or as he reached out to grab Peter and save him. He didn't let him drown, then resurrect him and said, "Why did you doubt me in the first place?" He saved the man as he was in a dying situation, and at that time he taught him the lesson of not doubting. And because then in Matthew 15 we go on to where he tests Peter's faith and he says, "Do you love me?" "Yes, I do." "Do you love me more than these?" And so on. We will not read that now for the sake of time, but I want to go back to talking about the Peter, right? So, despite his initial faith, Peter himself found in a very dramatic situation, right? Facing a very dramatic test. He was between, he had faith at first. That's not to say he didn't have any faith. He had some faith. He got up, walked out of the boat, and started walking. We don't know the distance. Whether it was 10 feet, 20 feet, or was much closer than that. We don't know any of that. Okay? But what we do know is that he had some faith. However, that impulsive faith vanished really quickly when he looked back and when he began to sink. That faith has disappeared. Okay? And this is what we're here, coming to this sanctuary, to this church, Sabbath after Sabbath, is to strengthen our faith. That our faith may not be like that of Peter in that moment. That was fast, that was just an impulsive, that was like a glitter that just sparked and then disappeared. Okay? Okay. Now, go back to Matthew 14:32. Matthew 14:32. What does it say there? And when they come unto the ship, the wind ceased. Once Jesus entered into the ship with Peter, the wind immediately ceased. Or in other translation, or when you go to look in Greek and Hebrews, it means to grow weary. The rough elements had spent themselves, having been overcome by the supernatural power of Jesus Christ. In an instant, the ship was calm and they were able to safely go to the shore. Now, this passage is very debatable by many theologians, where we see that one of the instances where it says, "and the ship was immediately at shore." I will not get into the definition of what does it mean to be immediately at shore, because this is not the subject for this hour, but you can study that on your own. So, the ending passage here in Mark, chapter, yes. What do we read, or when we read the passage that tells us that they did not understand about the loaves? What does that mean? Why did the disciples not understand about the loaves? We read in one of the instances, in one of the writers, he says they did not understand about the loaves. They understood not about the loaves. What does that mean? What does it mean? Go with me to Mark chapter 6, verse 51 and 52. Go with me to the book of Mark chapter 6, verse 51 and 52. Okay? "And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. This is the passage that I wanted to point out to you. Why is there a mention of the loaves here? Remember at the beginning I said this has a very interesting correlation between the previous miracle and this instance that we're discussing and analyzing here. Okay? I said earlier that this particular miracle is happening right after the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, correct? Mm-hmm. And here Jesus tells them that the reason why they were drowning is because they understood nothing that was going on at the miracle of creating 5,000 or in feeding 5,000 people. Okay? So why do the disciples not understand about the loaves? Only Mark, out of the 3 passages that we read, records the detailed write-up or the summary that is happening. They were greatly amazed in themselves, he writes, beyond measure, and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. So they did not understand about the loaves because their heart was hardened. And Jesus is here in the sea, is trying to teach them a lesson. Because if they had truly believed, nothing would have, been amazing to them. Nothing would have changed and shattered their faith. If they knew that He was the Messiah, and they knew that He was the Messiah, which means that the deliverer, the promised one, right? Their faith was too weak to believe deeply that He was the powerful God of creation, right? They knew that He was the Messiah, and the experience of loaves did not bring them to their realization that He was not the kind of Messiah they had expected and waited. Mm-hmm. He was the kind of the Messiah that could calm even the storm. Mm-hmm. And because they failed to learn that lesson once with the loaves and in the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus thought it necessary to teach it twice in them almost drowning, or not almost drowning, but in them being in the sea. Do you see the very unique correlation here between these 2 lessons? One comes after the other. In one, they realize that He is the Messiah and they want to make Him a king, but they do not realize He is not the type of Messiah they expect Him to be. He's a completely different Messiah, right? They did not realize that He is the type of Messiah that is powerful God of creation who controls everything. Alright? So, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about this, His Messiahship. So Mark explains, in Mark 6:52, as we read, let's read again. Mark 6:52, for they constrained not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Mark explains that His multiplying of the loaves of fish was just hours earlier and should have demonstrated His true identity to them, but they were so blinded and so preoccupied with their own agenda that neither one of them could really understand the miracle and what Jesus was trying to bring to them through this experience. Okay? Now, I want to point your attention to the book of Mark, chapter 4, verse 40. Just a few chapters back, in the book of Mark, chapter 4, verse 40. 40. 4:40. And He said unto them, why are ye so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? When Jesus had calmed the storm earlier, notice, this is not the first instance when Jesus had calmed the storm. Except in the previous instance, He was with them. In this instance, He was not with them, right? Mm-hmm. In this instance, He tells them, how is it that you have no faith? And then in Mark 6:52, we read what? That they had little faith because their heart was hardened. So here I'm emphasizing this and I'm bringing this to your attention that their hearts were hardened because their minds were slow to recognizing the significance of Jesus' miracle. In the previous one, he said, how is it that you don't have any faith? Now he says, how is it that you have little faith? Their hearts are still hardened. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is bringing to your attention that Jesus is periodically and systematically teaching them this lesson of their hearts that need to be softened. And much like you and I, or much like them, you and I are today needing our hearts to be softened. And that is why today Jesus is sending us those crosswinds, those opposite winds, those against us winds, to really bring us to the realization and soften our hearts that Jesus is powerful. And it is He that we must rely and go to for our troubles and necessities and needs, and not somebody else or something else, okay? I want to point your attention to really carefully. This does not mean that they did not recognize who Jesus was. They were conflicted about Jesus. I don't believe they were conflicted about Jesus per se, but simply they were slow to recognize His omnipotence, His power, His mission on this earth. And so Jesus takes extra careful time and attention to these little details, to the setting, to the choice of words He uses, to teach them these precious lessons of who He is and of what He is all about. Okay? And notice what happens after. Notice what happens after this is all completed. Matthew 14:33. Matthew 14:33. What do the disciples come and do? 33. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped Him, saying, of a truth, Thou art the Son of God. Truly you are the Son of God. The disciples' hearts were finally beginning to soften. But it took multiple lessons. It was the first experience of them drowning and Jesus calming the storm. They had no faith. Then it was the feeding of the disciples, feeding of the 5,000, They said, well, He's such a great miracle maker, let's make Him king and call it a day. Let's be free forever. The hearts were still hardened. And it is here, with Him walking on water and them having this experience, that finally their hearts are beginning to soften. The encouraging lesson of this miracle, short but very powerful and significant for each one of us, that we're all tested by stormy waves in our own life. Whether you believe it or not, whether you want to admit it or not, each one of us, whether you come to this church regularly or this is your first time attending or perhaps watching this at a later time in archives, you are going to experience storms. And your faith will be tested by the stormy trials in life. But despite us being tossed here and there on the waves, Jesus is always near. Jesus appeared out of nowhere for these disciples. I bet you that out of the possible waves, they imagined their salvation could come. Jesus walking on water towards them was not one of them. They could have said, oh, we should have taken Jesus with us. Or they were saying, oh, we should have just waited a couple hours. Or we should have gone in the morning. Or we should have left 2 hours ago. All these possible scenarios were replaying in their mind constantly. But I bet you Jesus might come to us was not one of them. But let's not diminish the power that Jesus can have in the life of His souls that are earnestly seeking to do His will. And let's give Him credit for His powerful Jesus who can calm even the storms. Amen.